Do you love to cook but have little to no space to actually make the things you want in your tiny ass kitchen? Well, me too. That's why I decided to make my own kitchen island to fix this. I'm going to start by making the top. First, I got some 2x6s and measured them out to 40 inches and took them to the miter saw to cut them to length. The final dimension is actually going to be closer to 38.5 inches, but I cut these bigger to leave room for error. And trust me, there will be error. Then I brought all the pieces to the table saw to scrap the sides. Next, I ran them through the planer to smooth out the faces. With all the sides done, I laid all the boards on my workbench and arranged them so they would have alternating grain pattern. This is important as it helps keep them from warping, but I ended up messing this part up and having to fix it, but more on that later. Then I added some registration marks where I was going to add biscuits and line everything up during the glue up. And then we grab the biscuit joiner, and y'all, this thing is awesome. It's like a beefed up sideways router with a spinning blade of death that cuts these perfect little slots to add these cute little biscuits that help to align and support the boards along the edges. Once all the slots were cut, it was time to add glue, the biscuits, and join everything together. And if you were paying attention, you would have seen where I messed up that led to the aforementioned mistake. After I got everything clamped up, I realized what I had done, so off camera I saw which boards needed to be rotated, so I recut them on the table saw, flipped them, glued them back together, and reclamped them. If you see something you like, I'll have links to everything I use in the description down below. Once it was dry and out of the clamps, I grabbed the chisel and scraped off the dry glue. Next, I clamped down a piece of wood to act as a straight edge and then took my handy dandy circular saw and cut the ends straight. And I repeated this process to make the bottom. And then we sand and sand and sand some more. Naturally, it wouldn't be a project of mine if I didn't light something on fire, so I'm going to torch the top and the bottom to highlight the grain. For the bottom, I'm going to stain it with a dark walnut stain. This way it'll show off the grain without distracting from the top, which I'm going to use this Unicorn Spit teal gel stain. This stuff is really cool. You just dilute it with as much or as little water as you want and then paint it on. If you're thinking this looks a lot like Johnny Build's kitchen island, that's because it was heavily inspired by his project. And by heavily, I mean that's the design my girlfriend liked the best. So there. I wiped off the excess stain, then let it dry. When it dries, it's going to dry a chalky color. This is perfectly fine because that's how you know when it's fully dry. To bring back some of the highlights of the wood grain, I took some fine steel wool and gently went over the areas I wanted to highlight. Nick at Build Dad Build has a great tutorial video using Unicorn Spit, and I'll link that down below. I'm going to use an oil-based poly to finish the top, and this instantly brings the color back to life because Unicorn Spit is a water-based stain. Now that the top and bottom are done, it's time to start working on the frame. I started with the sides, and just like the top, I measured out all my pieces, marked them, and took them over to the miter saw to cut them to length. I'm going to cut these 2x6s in half for the side. So I mark center, then cut them in half on the table saw. I'm going to join all the pieces together of the frame using glue and pocket screws. This is so it has the strength I need it to have and the screws are hidden out of plain sight. I laid everything out the way I wanted it. Applied the glue. Clamped it in place, then drove in the pocket screws. As I was making the stretchers for the frame, the table saw I was using was giving me problems and was making me uncomfortable to use, so I switched to a handsaw. At first I tried my Japanese pole saw, but it wasn't quite working for me, so I switched to a more aggressive one. It was getting a lot of friction, so I applied some oil with a wax finish to the blade and it helped it cut a lot smoother. Once they were all cut, I ran them through the planer and drilled more pocket holes. Before I assembled it, I sanded everything to 220 grit and rounded the edges. Then I torched the frame and applied a dark walnut stain so it would match the top and bottom. Finally, I finished it with a classic oak poly and stain so it would be a slightly lighter shade. I picked the sides of the top and bottom that I wanted the frame to attach to and covered them with blue tape. I marked out where the frame was going to attach. Making sure to leave enough space for a bit of overhang. Then I cut away the blue tape, used some sandpaper to scuff up the surface, then mix up some 5-minute epoxy and put it where I wanted the frame to adhere. I also added wood glue for good measure. I carefully lowered the frame into place and made slight adjustments so it was centered to the bottom. Then I permanently fixed it in place with screws. I laid down a tarp and placed the top on the floor. Then with a little help, I repeated the process and lowered the frame onto the top so it could be attached next. While it was flipped, I stained the underside of the frame and painted the screw heads. These 4-inch coasters are what will make this mobile. I marked where the pilot holes would go and drilled about an inch down. I can't use the nuts and bolts it came with, so I got these screws and washers instead. Once all that was done, I peeled up the blue tape and carefully flipped it over onto the casters. Then naturally, I had to test to make sure it was strong enough. Shockingly, I messed up the measurements of the frame, so to fix it, I just rounded over the edges with a block plane, sanded it smooth, then stained it. For the middle shelf, I'm going to use these poplar square dowels that I had laying around as the stretchers. For the shelf itself, I wanted to use up some of the scrap wood I had laying around, which funny enough was mostly hardwood. And with a cool transition, we have our shelf all glued up and ready to come out of the clamps. I cut one straight edge using the circular saw and then the other on the table saw. I cut channels into the dowels where the shelf would sit. To finish it, I'm applying this water-based satin poly. I placed four 14-inch spacers along the bottom, then lowered the shelf in place and attached it with pocket screws. I picked these pieces of walnut to use for the knife block on the side. Before joining them together, I cleaned up all the sides and ends and then smoothed out the surfaces. Then I drew some registration marks so I could realign them. I'm going to use oak dowels to join them. I drilled holes where I marked, added glue, then tapped them together with a mallet. I added walnut spacers on the side so the knives would rest securely on the knife block and not the tabletop. I marked about 2 centimeters apart for where to drill the holes for the magnets. Then with some supervision, I used the Forstner bit to drill holes. I'm going to use CA glue to hold the magnets in place, and this worked really well, except I would recommend gluing every other magnet in place first instead of side by side, or you'll have flying magnets everywhere. I added some food safe finish to the inside and then glued the knife block in place. After the glue was set, I drilled some holes so I could add more oak dowels to reinforce the knife block. Because they're not going to be exposed to water, I just used Titebond 2. After they were dry, I flush cut them with my pole saw, then sanded everything smooth and applied an oil finish. The last and final step is to add a power strip. This way I can use appliances. I scuffed up the bottom of it with some 80 grit sandpaper, mixed up some 5-minute epoxy, and applied it to the bottom of the power strip. Then I carefully placed it underneath the top, then used clamps to keep it in place while the epoxy cured. Afterwards, using a hammer drill and a large Forstner bit, I drilled a hole for the cord to go, and painted the inside brown so it would match the outside. To keep the cord in place, I used a couple of decorative tacks. And with it now in my apartment, this mobile kitchen island is finally done. Looking at this thing makes me so happy, and I have so much space to finally cook how I want. Let me know what you think of it in the comments down below. I want to thank all my patrons that helped make this project possible, including top tier patrons Steve Huber, Marion Ward, and Corey Wall. You guys rock. I also want to thank Bennett, Cece, and Amy who helped me physically in the shop. You guys were a big help. And thank you for watching to the end. It really helps me out a lot. I have another video here that I think you might also enjoy.